Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Well, okay, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and look forward to learning from your wisdom. We're kicking off a new series, so very, very excited, and so good to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. And let me, before you start, just commend you and appreciate you. I know you've been committed to this work, right? And really have shaped, the perspective of a lot of us, in terms of what I call not just intersection, but the coming together, right, of the convergence, to quote your book, of a life of faith with just operating in the marketplace. Now focus a bit more on investing, which, as you know, is an area I have a lot of interest and commitment to. So kudos to you, and I thank God for your ministry and the work you're doing, and I hope God will prosper it and it will have an impact on the continent and the entire Christian world, really, that should be interested in what's going on in our part of the world as well.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, I was just reflecting today that you've been at this for more than 30 years, so nearly 30 years. Next year it'll be your 30-year anniversary for what you're doing with African Capital Alliance. But before that, you began, let's just maybe dig a bit into your background. So you started off studying medicine, and you did a degree in medicine, and you got going in that regard. And I know that you're one of a number of accomplished siblings, and I was thrilled to meet your mom many years ago who produced all these wonderful kids. So you started off in the healthcare space, right?
I did. And, just to say a couple of things on that. So we had a system where you literally could go from O levels, the British curriculum O levels, that is year 5, as it were back then, to university, to do what they call a preliminary year. But then it meant you could do it relatively young, because I got into secondary school when I was just 10. I went to a boarding school. So I was literally 15 going to 16 when I took these so-called matriculation exams and I actually had applied for pharmacy and medicine. Got into pharmacy, but it was simple as medicine, and you literally had to do that prelim before choosing finally, right? So I did well enough in the prelim that when I decided that medicine was what I preferred, I was sent, to medical school. And so I got out of medical school at 21. And did, the housemanship or internship, and then did the compulsory national service as well. But it's fair to say that I was young enough that I was still asking some very basic questions around whether I really wanted a calling or a career in medicine. And I ultimately decided I didn't. And then, the rest of the story, I moved on and then joined you in the world of, accounting with Arthur Andersen, though not PwC.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you started with Arthur Andersen, which is now, I guess, been taken over by KPMG in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, yes. That's right. Yeah, back then it was the big 8, and then it slowly shrunk from there. But
yes,
that's right. Correct. Yeah, yes. I remember when I was with Pricewaterhouse in Cape Town, we actually looked at a merger with Deloitte back in the day, and eventually the London partners killed it. But before they eventually hooked up with Coopers. So great. So you went from there, you went on to do an MBA at Harvard and got into the world of finance. You're also a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants for Nigeria. And so you're medical doctor, chartered accountant, Harvard MBA. And so you went from Nigeria, you worked on Wall Street. You were with Goldman Sachs, as I recall, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, so again, so when I then left medicine and had the good fortune to join Arthur Andersen, which was in 1988, late 1988, they sent me off to London, where I did a bit of Not immediately. I mean, I started with them there, but I know in 1990, the first quarter, I was in London because, the way they were a global firm actually, and they had a bit of workload, and some of us were sent there to go and join the London office, which was for me was great experience working in an international setting. By the time I came back, I was, quite convinced I wanted to sort of pursue a further training exposure, veer towards more finance than just accounting and financial consulting, as they called what we did at the time. And I was fortunate, again, through my mentor and boss in Arthur Andersen, Richard Kramer, to apply to Harvard Business School, where he acted as a referee or reference, gave me a reference letter, and supported me really in multiple ways to go off to Harvard Business School, where I spent a couple of years. It was while I was there that I then got into investment banking with Goldman Sachs. I spent 1993 summer there in New York and in London, learning all about it. And really, by the time I got back to Harvard in the second year, which was 93, 94, I had reached certain conclusions. One was that I preferred to do something in Africa. And I wanted to be on what they call the buy side, the investment side, not the investment banking side, not the advisory part, but the, sort of investing part. And this whole private equity thing, which was beginning to take off at the time, I really wanted to see if I could get into it. And fortunately, I was able to get into it through a gentleman called Thomas Barry, who had left the Rockefeller family to sort of start a fund for South Africa. And of course, we also took on partners when we came to South Africa in 1994.
Right. So you worked in South Africa for a while, and then African Capital Alliance, 1997, as I recall, you set it up then, right?
Yes, so we overlapped. So in 1997, I started coming to Nigeria to set up African Capital Alliance with Dick Kramer. And then by January 1998, we set it up in 97. By January 1998, we operationalized it fully, and I moved back to Lagos.
Yeah, fantastic. Yes. And I had the privilege of meeting you in 2008 when our mutual friend Ben brought me over to Nigeria. It was great to meet with you, get to know you and John and some others in your Apostles in the Marketplace community, and of course at African Capital Alliance. And so it's been a long time friendship. So thanks for bearing with me all these years. I think I've even been given, I have been given a Nigerian name. I've been there so many times,
No, you've been, the thing about the way you operate Breath is that when you show up, you're really present, right? I think we felt your impact for sure.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, okay, I wanted to thank you for the work that you and your team did on this new book that I'm putting out actually tomorrow, Investing with Africa. And
congratulations.
So that's going to come out. So what I did was I split it into two. One is like a flyover, an executive summary for people with a very short attention span. So this one's very, very thin. It's just really the executive summary. And then the detailed book is coming out tomorrow. There's a website that goes with it, Investing with Africa. And the goal is a shared passion to have the right people come with the right resources to partner locally, not a paternalistic view and not a view that Africa needs aid, but just really looking at the opportunities, but with the eyes wide open. And I thought about you because I thought, man, there's all of these people who are all of a sudden interested in Africa, and you've been at it for more than 30 years. How do you feel about that? Are you excited about that, or?
I am excited. I am excited, Brett. And the reason I'm excited is that, I do believe that it will serve Africa's interest and the global investment community's interest, right? To find the right models for investing in Africa. People tell me about the demographics, and they usually pick on Nigeria and some other fast-growing African countries. I just was in a meeting earlier today with somebody who is in Europe, who said Europe, is very mature, understands the private equity business quite well, but is very competitive. We would like to do more in Africa, and we're actually trying to figure out ways to work together. So I think that flow of capital, because the capital really, the West is capital rich, Africa is opportunity rich, right? And that handshake can only help, and it takes professionalism, which is really what your book is about, and effective presence, right, in terms of those that have been doing it and who are on the ground to actually make this work. If we're going to go beyond theory to actual doing or actual investing, which is what you're talking about in your book and what I espouse as well. Yes.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent. Yeah. So, just to give listeners a bit of context, you've been involved in a number of different deals before we get into your time in government, which we'll get into in a moment. And I remember one of our fabulous conversations we had when we were doing the Kingdom Summit, and we were
That's true.
standing in the green room, and you were there, and I think there was a chief of staff for one of the governors were there, and so on. And you talked a bit about how when you were a young man, you used to ride your bicycles to the prof's house, and you used to pray and talk about what can be done to transform Nigeria many, many years ago. And fast
Yes.
forward, you as a group of friends and brothers were making that happen. So yeah, just an amazing story. So we'll get to the government story in a moment,
Okay.
but let's just talk about what sort of things have you been involved in? Because sometimes people think Africa and they think either very, very narrow things. They don't think around corporate deals. They think a bit about, niche investments. It's easier, cheaper for me to get my app development done in Lagos or in Kenya than in Silicon Valley. And they're thinking in a niche way. Give us a bit of a sense of the type of things you've been involved in from MTN and so forth.
So let me summarize it this way, because as you know, 30 years is a long time and a lot would have happened in that time, naturally. To pick up the story from Dick Kramer again, so when we basically decided to form African Capital Alliance, we understood the importance of people and the players that you bring to the table. I came with Thomas Barry, who had done the same thing. So you could say we had the whether you call it the blueprint or sort of the formula or the game plan, right, for attracting capital from the West to invest in sort of frontier markets, in this case, African markets, starting with South Africa. The whole thesis, investment thesis or theory was that like we could do in Nigeria and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa what we had done successfully in South Africa, because that experiment or that investment in South Africa was very successful. It was called South Africa Capital Growth Fund. We do a South African firm called Capital Partners that became great and one of the powerhouses in South Africa. Dick, in turn, brought some of the leading businessmen in the country, three of them, Chief Ernest Chonekon, who had run the Unilever companies, and I also had a stint in government as a head of an interim government when we were going into a transition into democracy. Pascal Dozier, who had built one of the most successful banks, Diamond Bank, and then a gentleman called Mohammed Hayatuddin, who is, by the way, still around and had taking a federal savings bank and turned it into a very successful commercial bank, FSB. Again, so these were successful and well-known business people. And the whole idea was to, bring professional capital to work in Nigeria and the rest of the continent. Now there was a snag or a caveat. We had a military government at the time in 1980. We had a gentleman or a man called President Sani Abacha. He used to be a general, but he changed his name to president. And it wasn't easy to attract capital from outside. But we believed enough in what we were doing that we decided to start anyway, right? So I was convinced. I moved back, started the business, and we raised money from corporate pension plans that were in Nigeria. Citibank, Chevron Pension Fund, Unilever, and so on and so forth. Raised about $20 million from them. It was not a lot, but it was enough to start. And by the way, some of the major multilateral institutions joined us after we had a democracy in 1999. International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank, something that used to be called the Commonwealth Development Corporation, CDC, which was part of British government, is now called BII, British Investment International, and the Dutch equivalent called Dutch FMO. So we ended up with about $35 million. And our investment approach and thesis was to partner with private sector players who wanted to do things, do growth investing, growth capital investing, growth businesses, in sectors that were deregulating or that had deregulated, where the private sector could lead and do things to, excellent standards and therefore get the returns, and it worked beautifully. I mean, in fact, it worked so well that our fund is still a reference point. It's the best performing fund that has been raised in Africa. It wasn't a lot, I agree. It was just 35 million, but it returned, I think, 14 to 15 times money to the investors, right? I mean, to, back. So it was, and some of those returns came from some very outlying results we got in places like MTN. So one of those partnerships was with MTN. When MTN came to launch its mobile network in Nigeria, we were not just a partner, but we had to mobilize the local capital because they wanted to do a 60-40 deal where they would own majority, but they wanted to be sure local capital was in it, and while they identified some very prominent people, they needed somebody to work with them to make it a professional, and we played that role. So we invested from our fund, but we also then acted as the others co-invested with us, and we set up a vehicle which was called Cell Telecom, through which we owned 22%. We couldn't even get to the 40 because there was capital shortage. Of course, everybody after the fact was like, why didn't you tell me? But as people usually say that when something succeeds, because that investment got, I think, 44 times money. I mean, it was a phenomenal success. Yes.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. One of my other stories, I remember one of my favorite memories was sitting across the desk from you in your office when you were going through the purchase of Union Bank. And that was probably, as I recall, around about 2010 or thereabouts. I remember I was busy writing the book Repurposing Capital. And in my research, you might recall what happened was that Barclays Bank got accused of being involved in the slave trade because there was a slave trader called David Barclay, and the legal department at Barclays came out and said, no, we were formed by 4 Quakers. And our mandate was to provide capital for Christian business people. And so you and I had that conversation about whether God wanted his bank back, because Union, of course, was formerly Barclays. So that was another.
That's very correct.
Yeah,
that was another acquisition, and one of the landmark acquisitions, by the way, because that was a $500 million capital deal, right? So the idea was Union Bank, which had been a storied bank in the country, got distressed because he had given a bunch of bad loans, and we had a new central bank governor who put in some very prudential guidelines and did a stress test. And the banks that didn't pass the test were required to recapitalize. And central bank was involved in that process with the bank, and we basically acquired the majority. I think it was like 65% for $500 million. The government, by the way, put in $2 billion, which is why, just to cover the hole, because nobody was going to fill that hole. So, it was a very interesting investment. We attracted a lot of capital from the US, from Europe, from some wealthy families. The results were mixed, I have to be honest. And they were mixed because, again, this question of how you apply, Western methods of doing business, to Africa came into play. We had to sort of work as a consortium, as a club, and I believe that I got called unexpectedly. I got called into government because I was leading that effort. And when I moved into government, because we eventually closed the deal in 2014. And then in 2015, I was called into government, we got some good results. But I would say some of the guys, including a gentleman who ran then Barclays Bank, I'm trying to remember his name, the guy that did Atlas Mara, you know who I'm talking about, the Atlas Mara guy, basically came and took a major position in the bank, right, and thought he knew how to do it, right, but eventually, like I said, it was a very high profile transaction, one that showed that this formula of private sector capital partnering with opportunity in Africa could be done in multiple sectors, not just telecommunications. Banking is another one, and I can share other examples, including insurance. We just took an insurance company that started in Nigeria but has gone throughout the continent called Continental Reinsurance. It's now listing on the Botswana Stock Exchange, and it's one of the most successful listings they're going to have there this year.
Yeah. Now, okay, I'd like to get your comment on something, as you talked a bit about that and bringing sort of a Western mindset to investing with Africa. Peter Cunningham, who's based out of Zimbabwe, summarized 3 things. He said there's a different worldviews and operating systems. So there's an Islamic, an Eastern, and a Western. And the Islamic view says, look, Africa needs guiding, from and they look for community control in a way. The Eastern worldview says Africa is an opportunity, and they just look for economic control. But the Western view is sort of that Africa needs fixing. And so then they come with a whole lot of guidelines and regulations, and you can have our money, but you got to have this percentage of that and this and these rights and those things and so forth. Does that gel with your observation of how different people approach Africa? Because you've seen them all.
I think so. I think so. The thing about these mantras, as you know, is that like they can be simplistic, but some of them have a lot of wisdom in them. And this guy is actually onto something. And let me illustrate that. Now, if you look at the Eastern, which of course the best represents China, you know, that's been the attitude of China. I mean, China basically just sees us as an economic opportunity. Some might even say ready for exploitation or whatever, right? But they clearly make this point that they don't need to guide you, they don't need to fix you. Your morality is whatever it is, and I'm not here to judge, right? But some African leaders like that, right? But you also have to be cautious about that because then you have to be sure what you're getting, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you come to the Western view, you are right, and it's best demonstrated by these development finance institutions, including the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation and so on. They come with a package. Some people have argued that that package can actually, if not handled with wisdom, become a deterrent to commercial capital. Because those things become almost like constraints, right? That can constrain. But the intention is noble, is well-meaning, and when you deal with experienced players like ourselves, even if I say so, we're able to negotiate with them and turn them into catalytic capital, right?
Yeah.
By telling them that some of these things will work. For instance, we've worked with people like IFC, the British BII, the Dutch FMO, across multiple funds, but then they let us run it. We agree with them at the top vehicle, in what we call a limited partnership agreement, because they're limited partners, which means that they would be one step removed, sit on the advisory committee, what we call the LPAC, Limited Partners Advisory Council, but they do put in things like, making sure ESG, environment, social, and governance is done well, and so on. And we can live with those things, not just live with them, we can turn them into a positive impact story, which is what we've been doing. But you're right that you have to be careful, otherwise those bells and whistles can become a constraint to capital and to growth.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. I think also you're also alluding to the fact that you've worked in London and in New York, South Africa, that there is value added that comes with capital from outside of the continent. I mean, there can be financial disciplines, maturity, expertise that can keep African investors out of trouble in some way. So there is capital always has an opportunity to disciple that comes with it. Yeah, but when it's moralistic or greenwashing or virtue signaling, then it constrains local entrepreneurship and investing. So yeah, well said. Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your time in government. I alluded to it earlier, so take us back a little bit on that story. You've long had a passion, not just for being in Africa to make money, but to advance the kingdom of God through your skills in many, many ways. And you're part of a cadre that's been doing this. Tell us a bit about that story and how you got into government.
Interesting story. So, first, how did it all start? We had a new government. A gentleman who had been the pastor of my church in Lagos, Pastor Yemi Oshibajo, had gotten into politics. He had been the Attorney General of Lagos State, then was eventually tapped to be the vice presidential candidate for this party that was in opposition, seeking to go into government. It was called APC, Action People's Congress, or something like that, right? And he President Buhari won, right? They won, and so he had to move to Abuja, which is the seat of government. We were operating in Lagos. He actually handed over to me, right, to be the pastor of the church because he felt I would provide the right leadership at that point for as he was guided by God, I believe. So I started doing that, and I was quite happy with that, right? I felt that that was very helpful that we had supported Prof, as we call him, to go into government. I remember somebody teasing me. I met a friend in New York at some event, and he said, "Okay," because then they hadn't appointed a cabinet. I said, "Okay, what if you are asked to come to government?" I'm like, "I'm already a minister. I'm a minister of the gospel. I'm serving in church. I'm a minister in the marketplace. That's a handful already." As if this gentleman was being prophetic. A couple of weeks later, I get 2 calls on a Sunday. I had preached a sermon on a Sunday morning, got home, and I got 2 calls from 2 friends. I mean, when I say one is a friend, one is a mentor type or somebody I knew well, who was one of the top traditional rulers in the country, and a corporate board sort of guy, somebody very well known. he was approached by the chief of staff of the president, as I found out later, to say they had been looking for somebody with my kind of background, somebody who had an economic background, as I saw it, finance background, as I saw it, who had integrity. And they wanted somebody from my state because they were trying to fill slots from particular states. And as God will have it, he said, I can think of no better person than Okey Enelamah. He spoke to somebody else who has served with him from another part of the country. And he's like, have you considered Okey Enelamah? He will be ideal for this. The challenge is, his hands are full. Anyway, they then were sort of asked by the president and this chief of staff to do everything possible to get me to come and see them. I remember preparing with Dick Kramer. We thought it was going to be a dialogue. You go and see the president and his staff and you explain your point, and then maybe if you reach a landing, you might do it. But with the idea that you explain why you can't do it.
Yeah.
And so my first lesson was I didn't even see the president. I see the chief of staff.
Yeah.
Who takes it for granted I'm going to do it. Is like, you have to serve your country. The president is not assumed that you've taken it. Don't get me into trouble. You couldn't even get back to the president and say you were going to say no. And then he then starts trying to make it possible at his level. I say that only because that was the first lesson about, just how you work with government and how these presidents are shielded, right? So maybe you could say I was a bit naive to think I'll just go and sit down with him and start a negotiation. And he was an older guy as well, behaved a bit like a bit of a, princely man, right? Very, carried himself very well. Anyway, then, I get into the role, right? But the main thing that made me do it, you will understand this. God actually spoke to my heart that day and said, what if I'm the one asking you to do it? Right? And that ministration, that conviction grew with time. And the second thing God did, is that he then spoke to me after I agreed to do it, and said, focus on enabling environment. I had him very clearly. He said, your mandate is enabling environment. And when God gives you a word, he explains it. Yeah. He will send you help. And it's God because everything we tried to do that time, including getting what I call a Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council launched with all the full presidential powers, went through in a way that was somewhat surprising. But I believe because it was divine. We didn't achieve everything we wanted, but we laid the foundation. But here is the real testimony that you'll find fascinating. There was a lady who is now the current industry minister, industry trade and investment minister. Her name is Dr. Jumoke Oduwole. She had come to serve as a special advisor to the president, actually to work with Prof because she was a student of Prof. She's a lawyer at University of Lagos, although she eventually went to Stanford to do her PhD. And she had come to work on this same area in government because she was very interested in how government enables business as part of her thesis as well as area of passion. So she worked very closely with me. When I was finishing my role, before I finished, a brother of ours said to me that God said, don't worry about what I've asked you to do. That work somehow will continue, right? Even when you're gone. And I, of course, what I thought that meant was that I will be able to institutionalize what I'm doing and it will become the law of the country. But when I found out I wasn't getting it institutionalized before I left, and I wanted to talk to this lady just to explain what I'm doing and some of the things I want to codify working with her and the president and the vice president. But she said something to me. She said, okay, I'm even more passionate about this than you. So you don't need to be just preaching to the choir. This is my passion. And to think that one or two administrations later, God then makes her get the same role, you couldn't have chosen a better person. So for me, it just tells me, there's a word in Ecclesiastes, I think it's Ecclesiastes 3:14 that says, whatever God does is forever. Nothing can be added, nothing can be removed. God's purpose is that men should fear him. Things like that really fascinate me about God, right? That he can take something and in the midst of all that is going on, find people to keep that vision going, even in the midst of what on the surface might appear like chaos.
You remind me of a phrase I heard when I was a young pastor pastoring a church. It used to scare me. The phrase was, God buries his prophets and finishes his work.
Wow. Yes. That's exactly that's exactly the point. That's a good one, by the way.
It reminds us that we're human. God buries his prophets and finishes his work. So fantastic. So that's great. And one of the things I like about this is that one of the objections or the myths about the risk, and it's not just a myth, but Africa is a very regulated environment. It strikes me that what the colonial era left behind in places like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on, particularly when the Brits were there, was a lot of rules and regulations around setting up businesses. When I moved to California in 1986, I mean, you can set up a business in hours. You just register the name, you get up. I mean, it's harder to close them, but to get them set up is a piece of cake. Whereas in Africa, the legal constraints, the red tape, and so on. So it sounds like you chipped away at that and you set some policies and some frameworks in place that can actually make it easier to do business in Africa. Is that fair?
And to corroborate your point, Brett, just last week, I was in Helsinki, Finland, right? They had this thing, they call it Northern Lights Summit, right? And they brought some of the senior government executives or functionaries or leaders from the Indian government, right, to talk about India. And the main point they were making about Prime Minister Modi was like the main work he has done, right, is to just dismantle this bureaucracy. And India is growing at 7, 8, 10%. And they think it will continue, for the foreseeable future. And they just kept making the point. Take away this bureaucracy, take away this red tape, and business will thrive. And for me, I just felt this is what God was speaking to me about. It's just that I wasn't president or prime minister, right? I could only do it to a certain extent. But I tell you, that opportunity is waiting, and this is the word of God. I mean, for God, God can make a simple statement and that will have wide-ranging implications. I mean, can you imagine making you a minister and of everything you could do, it just says focus on ease of doing business, enabling environment. Yeah. So I think there's something there. It's a big point spread.
Right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Fantastic. Yeah. So you've also been involved in terms of empowering others. So you've been involved with you founded the Nigerian University of Technology and Management. Tell us a bit about that.
Another fascinating story, by the way. So I was part of a fellowship many years ago conducted by the Aspen Institute in Colorado, where they call it this global Aspen Fellows, initiative. And the whole idea is, as part of their sort of work, right? They want to encourage people, to practice enlightened, effective leadership, as they call it, through a program called Moving from Success to Significance. So what they do is take successful people in business, in not-for-profit sector, and it was funded by philanthropists, mostly from the US, right? But they pay for everything. For a 2-year period, you go through this fellowship. But there was one requirement. You must do a project, right? After that, to give back, so in my cohort, it wasn't even my original idea, frankly. Somebody said, why don't we do one of these IIT? We're thinking about what will have the most impact. Now, look at the impact the IIT of India has had, India Institutes of Technology. Now, why don't we do one and then use it as a model to do more, plenty across Africa? I like the idea, but we didn't do it at the time. And then I became a minister. And I saw a clip, it was one of these 60 minutes, this CBS program that's been under attack in the US, 60 minutes CBS program, where they were talking about the impact that the Indian IIT has had. And they mentioned all the corporate execs and CEOs of these big tech companies in the US and elsewhere, and just all across the US and India itself and beyond, who have come from these schools, right? And just how transformative and impactful it's been. And I like to, see God at work in the marketplace. I was thinking about this. I called up one of my, somebody from my cohort, Ige Mokede, who runs Access Bank, is chairman of Access Bank. I said, why don't we do this? And he said, sure, let's talk about it. But then something happened that was very remarkable. I was on a flight to UN General Assembly meetings in New York, and I was flying with the Minister of Education and the head of the Nigerian Universities Commission, who sort of worked under him. And the head of the Nigerian Universities Commission sat next to me on the plane. And he started a conversation to say, Honorable Minister, do you think we can, get involved in some specialized universities to promote science, to promote, that we've done all these general universities, but they don't seem to be enough. I remember I was already thinking about this and working on this. I just said, this must be God. So I said to him, tell me more about what you have in mind. And I said, sure, it's a very good idea. And I would like to work on it if you guys will give the license. He said, sure. And it's called a long story short. They actually gave us a license, and also I tested it in New York among the Nigerian diaspora. They liked it a lot. These are some high-profile names like Bayo Ogunlesi, who you may have heard of. He sold his business to BlackRock, and is one of the richest blacks in America. They sold the business for $13 billion. I think it's worth maybe or $10 billion, but it's worth a lot of money. It's certainly one of the richest Nigerians in the sort of banking and investment space. Of course, Dangote is the richest of them all. But I say all that to say that's where this university came from, Nigerian University of Technology and Management. But we called it the MIT of Africa. The whole idea is that, like, we wanted something world-class, transformative, that is planted right in the heart of Africa. We still got our DNA and sort of what I'll call IP, right, from the IIT model, because there was a McKinsey partner that introduced us to the first person who had gone to IIT, who launched the India School of Business, and is also part of what they call Ashoka University, which is under liberal arts university. They've started there, that is doing very, very well. Here it's more difficult to get into that university than even the Ivy Leagues in the US. So they've been very supportive. And I tell you, the university is off to a great start and is definitely going to produce one of the Africa success stories in terms of STEM. We'll call it a STEM and science, technology, engineering and management and an entrepreneurship university, STEM and management and entrepreneurship university.
Fantastic. Yeah. One of the stats that I heard when I was in Nigeria, and you could perhaps verify it, is if you talk about education and you look at the number of Nigerians that are studying, PhD candidates in the US, I mean, it's phenomenal. I've even noticed, by the way, with World Cup soccer, you got a confession to make. Like every team seems to have a Yoruba or your Nigerian name.
Absolutely. So, and Nigeria itself is not at the World Cup. Tell me if that's not a sign of poor administration. What is? So we clearly have a talent. Dick Kramer, my mentor, used to say that when you put Nigerians in a right setting, they succeed beyond your expectation. Yeah. That the problem is not in Nigeria, the problem is the system. That we need to, have the right systems. Back to this question of enabling environment and systems.
Yeah. I know when I first came to Nigeria, I was preaching at the King's Court, and it just struck me, and I shared it, that faith-based entrepreneurs, business people, could become Nigeria's best export. And, I just think so much talent, so much capability, and intellect fused with faith. It's not like the intellect over here in the spiritual life. That's one of the things that's fascinating about Africa, is these things are already integrated one way or another. Spirituality and life are, not separate compartments generally. And so, that's wonderful to see. Yeah. Okay. So, the enabling environment, the private sector, you're positive about that and about the developments. And it sounds like you're working across Africa with your mention of Botswana and other different things. The view, regarding risk, I had a guy who was in our last executive intensive, and your brother John has been through one of our executive intensives. And he said he was all bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, started an IT company in South Africa, went off to Dallas and got there and told them, look, we've self-funded, we've got revenue, we haven't taken outside investors, we've got skin in the game and all of this stuff. And the investors said, well, when are you going to tell us the good news? Because they operate off debt and shared ownership and all of these different things. And I thought about the Americano, and now, Americano coffees, you get that all over the place. But now in South Africa, and probably in Nigeria as well, on the menu, they put Africanos. They don't put Americanos anymore. The same thing, rebranded. But I'm thinking about this whole question of risk and the perception of risk versus real risk in Africa. You've had a living dealing with this. What's the current status versus the old stories?
So one of the people that has a great expression on this I want to lead into the conversation is Thomas Barry, right, who I partnered with. He says that the reason he likes investing in Africa and indeed other markets where he's invested is that he likes these places where the perceived risk is way higher than the real risk, right? So because that's the arbitrage he's actually literally tapping into to make money, right? Yeah. But the key thing is that he shows up. Right? He doesn't just talk about it from, 10,000 miles, 6,000 miles away or whatever. He shows up, and then he's very big on picking the right partners, right? And then working with them to actually invest that capital and get a return. He's done it in South Africa. He did it with us, and so my own experience is that risk is, yes, what can go wrong, you identify it. But usually, and in fact, I was speaking to somebody earlier today, one of these great researchers who made the same point, that what they find with the most successful entrepreneurs and investors is that, like, they have their vision, they have their goals, their ambition even, right? But then they're able to manage the risk, they're able to, find the right levers to pull or the right strings to pull to hold that risk. And, it's not something that is passive or, that just happens on its own. Things are, I mean, as an example, we excel in partnerships. The reason we excel in partnerships is that we're very good at managing the risks on this side, right? We invested a lifetime in 30 years, whether it's currency risk or reputational risk or regulatory risk or corruption risk or you name it, right? Governance
risk.
Political risk. The key is that, like, you have to have enough understanding, enough of what I call not infrastructure, but the ecosystem, right, in which to nurture those investments, and particularly for those of us that invest in private capital, right? I mean, have you had things go wrong? Absolutely, but I tell you, the returns have more than made up for those, and we've learned a lot, by the way, through the cycle. So I would argue that today, back to your question, that we are risk managers. There's a firm in South Africa called Cadiz. I don't know if you know them. They did very well, and what's their main point? We know how to manage risk. The upside takes care of itself, and they literally were coming to do derivatives even in Nigeria, right? Just to find ways to deal with risks across the continent. So it's not something that people have not studied and understood and know how to manage, and that's why I think it's a major opportunity. Yes.
Yeah. When I was doing my thinking regarding the book, as you know, I thought about this quad thing because that's about, the four boxes, just thought about low trust environments, high trust environments, and then high ethnic diversity and moderate ethnic diversity. And so you can kind of get these four different zones, as you saw, the friction, the resilience, and so forth. And so when you think about South Africa and Nigeria, two places where you've invested, they're kind of hybrid cases in a sense, because some people can look at South Africa and say, wow, the political risk, you don't know what's going to happen. But at the same time, there's a pretty good infrastructure. There's a lot of history. There's courts that work and so on. And Nigeria is interesting in the sense that you've got a high ethnic diversity. If I remember, about 135 languages.
More, yes.
Is it more than that?
I said more because, some of the languages are dialects, right? So, but I get your point. Your point is well made, yes.
Yeah, and so you have this situation where there is a perceived risk, but I want to also just tap into a little bit more. You mentioned the ecosystem of people and relationships. And, when I said to Ben, Ben, if I'm going to come to Nigeria, I want to know about, men and women of peace who are the real deal, who are doing stuff. He said, we have apostles in the marketplace. We have an old organization doing this already. And what struck me as I look at high risk situations, high diversity situations, or high diversity, maybe even low trust, that the faith element of networks of faith actually offset that and can create, I'm not talking about parking lot deals, as Henry Kessner says, but I'm talking about real rich relationships of trust. I mean, I've got to know you and the folks at Apostles in the Marketplace, people at Redeem, people in other situations where there are kingdom thinkers who free flow between different faith networks in the marketplace. And this offsets risk from my perspective. Do you share that view?
Yeah, and the reason is obvious. Once you pay attention to what you're saying, Brett, it actually becomes quite obvious, right? Because if the people are genuinely people of faith, faith is the gospel of righteousness, right? Faith is the gospel that says God sees everything and rewards those who honor him and honor their brothers and their sisters, who love him, love their brothers and sisters and work with them. And for us, we have found that once you go beyond the labeling and what I call the mantra of sort of like, I'm a Christian or I'm not, and you deal with, like Ben was telling you, the real deal, which is what we try to do, in our pursuit in the marketplace, and mentoring people as well, right? And showing them role models, examples. Ben is an example, I'm an example, and we are many, right? Examples who have succeeded by applying the right values, by honoring God in the marketplace. So you find those biblical examples of the Josephs and the Daniels and so on are still present today. God is still doing that work, and they do mitigate risk. And that was actually part of the secret to the success, right? So if you look at what was it we brought when I said we're very good in partnerships, it's exactly that, right? Picking the partners carefully and then working with them to, to sort of do business where you have shared values that are similar. You put in proper governance. One more thing I would say on that, Brett, is that it's not just, it's a bit like what they call the Missouri state in the States. It's not just trust me, but it's like show me, because you can put all those things into an agreement. And one of the signs that a person is that way is that they actually don't mind, right, making those commitments in a legally binding form. So it's not just that the trust is there, but also it's verifiable. So it's not, so I tell my investors that we have proper documentation in everything we do, and we choose people who understand why. And we do things, and we may never look at the agreements once they're signed and put away. But then you don't have a situation where somebody's saying, I don't want to do any agreements, or why should I sign a proper agreement? Meanwhile, you're dealing with fiduciary capital, you should.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, that's very, very good. I like that. Yeah. So I have two closing questions. Let me first talk a little bit about the diaspora, because you touched on them a bit. It's quite amazing, the size of the African diaspora. Now, that can be defined quite broadly or narrowly, but just people who've actually been born in Africa, for example, and who are now living overseas. How do you see them impacting the investment landscape and beyond remittances to mom?
I think they're an important group, and I'm glad you're focused on them as well, Brett. And the reason is the following. As you know, investing at times goes beyond just return that I can get anywhere. That's important. But people usually, I'm also a chartered financial analyst, by the way. When you do that program, one of the things you learn is what they call the people's preferences and unique considerations and why they do what they do. When you do it, for instance, for the diaspora, you find that one of them is, I would like to invest in a continent if I can find right opportunities. I studied medicine, like we talked about earlier. My classmates are always calling me saying, we want to invest back home. Are there any opportunities? Because they know I invest on a professional basis. And some of them have invested with African Capital Alliance. And they say they want to start an investment club. So I think that for them, they could actually be a rich source of capital. Some countries have tried to tap into it. Nigeria is doing a diaspora fund, billions of dollar fund, trying to give it, state backing and state. And I think they'll raise the money if they do that. And they do it well and show that there are some return expectations that can be, met. Now, there's a lot of work still needed to organize them. Remember that you also have to do with regulation on the other side. For instance, in the US, there are now Americans. There's something called a non-solicitation unless you are there. So there's some regulatory things you need to deal with, but these are not insurmountable hurdles, right? Yeah. I do believe that is an important pool of capital. Some of them are also in important places where they can have a multiplier effect, right? When we invested in South Africa, there was a guy called Vincent May. You may have heard of him. He's one of the most successful South Africans that invested in private equity in the US. And I'm talking about gold standard. South Africa. He was in fact, he wasn't chairman. He was on the advisory board of that South African fund. Because Tom Barry knew him from New York. He's still a friend till today. He must be in his mid-80s by now. He's just very distinguished and very successful.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Okay, so final question. Okay. What do you wish that the investment community understood about the Nigerian context specifically and about Africa in terms of things that you wish they understood a bit better? So you had to do less evangelism with them and more partnering.
I think for me, one of the most important things we're still struggling with is access, right? Just in terms of that story getting heard. Because my experience that when the story gets heard properly, people actually find out a lot of these myths and they follow through. But you find that right now, Africa is still almost struggling with relevance when it comes to investing as opposed to aid, like you said, right? Where, just whether it's being part of the emerging markets index or being part of some thing that gives you relevance so that people can actually do the work or pay attention, right? Right now, we're still, trying to find ways to do that. You talked about Henry Kessner earlier. If you look at what you're doing and what he's doing, it's all about some form of evangelism, right? To say, guys, there's this whole continent, there's stuff going on there, which you don't know. And that's what your book is about, right? So I think in that respect, the book is very important, right? In just raising awareness and bringing information and bringing expertise. I mean, not to promote you, Brett, but if you look at someone like you who grew up in Africa, in South Africa, way back as a professional, top-notch professional, moved to the US. In other words, you understand the South African market, the African market, and understand the US market. That's how India took off. That's how China took off. I mean, if somehow that could be galvanized, right, where people can work with professionals who know what they're doing, then you find that the spirit of partnership will kick in and a lot of good things can happen. I'm not saying people should just blindly make investments without knowing who they're dealing with. But there are people who are willing to, partner with them. And that's how African Capital Alliance was set up. And frankly, I think there is work for us to do to just play these galvanizing, I don't want to call it intermediary, but just bringing people with capital to the opportunity on the continent in a way that they can get very good returns and sleep well at night.
Yeah. Well, okay, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. It's been a delight to know you these nearly 20 years and to see the work that you've been doing for long before I knew you. And I really appreciate all that you're doing. And one of the things that I have loved as I've got to know you and some of the members of your family is just seeing the impact that you've had in different sectors of society, the full integration of your work and your faith. I've been in some parts of Africa where a pastor cannot have a job in the marketplace. That's not a problem in Nigeria. You guys all have 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. I don't know when you sleep, but thank you so much for all that you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brett, and congratulations on your new book. And I pray for every success. And please keep your commitment, your faith, your passion for Africa while doing the interesting things you're doing in the US as well. It's a great pleasure connecting with you today. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Okay. God bless you. Thank you so much.
God bless you too. Thanks for reaching out and for the connection. Thank you.
Thank you.